This is Duke University.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and the lengthy, in-depth on my background. I appreciate that. You mentioned you liked the title of the book, A Single Roll of the Dice. It's actually a quote from one of the Obama administration officials who I interviewed. The book was about the initial effort of the administration to pursue diplomacy back in 2009. It was a very short-lived effort. It ended after a couple of months. And this individual described it, who was part of it, said, well, it was a single roll of the dice. It either had to work right away or not at all. I'm very glad that the next effort by the administration to pursue diplomacy was not a single roll of the dice. It was a much more profound and dedicated effort to resolve things diplomatically. And if there is an update to the book, I'll definitely change the title to reflect that. I'm actually working on a new book. I hope you like the title of this one. It's called Losing an Enemy: Obama, Iran, and the Legacy of Diplomacy. It will be out later next year, hopefully. I have to write it first, but... Sorry?
Also from Yale?
Also from Yale, exactly. It's a great pleasure being here at Duke, and it's a great pleasure to be here to talk about this issue. It's a bit of a I told you so tour for me right now, because those who have known the work that I've done in the past have been very much in favor of diplomacy, and I've been one of the voices who argue that this could work if it was done the right way. And to be frank, there were a tremendous amount of skeptics. A lot of folks in Washington, D.C. who believed that diplomacy could never work, that the Iranians would never come to the table, that they would never be serious in the negotiations, and even if they were, they would never sign the dotted line, and even if they signed the dotted line, they would never implement it. Even if they implemented, they would still cheat. All of this skepticism, and equally on the Iranian side, people who said that there's no way that the United States ever would be able to uphold any agreement with Iran because of its opposition to the Islamic Republic. That Obama may be well-intended, but he doesn't run the show because the system inside of the United States itself would never allow for such a transition, for such a shift away from the containment and the confrontation with the United States. And here we are, after 20 months of diplomacy. Now the Secretary of State of the United States and the Foreign Minister of Iran are Facebook friends. And they text each other, and they DM each other on Twitter. In fact, they even have, on a few occasions, public exchanges on Twitter. Secretary of State John Kerry has spent more time with Javad Zarif of Iran in the last 2 years than he has spent with any other foreign minister of the world. That's how intense this diplomacy has been. That's the type of dedication that is needed in order to actually resolve a conflict of the depth and magnitude that existed between the United States and Iran. What I wanted to do here today is to first go over a couple of reasons as why I think this is a very good deal, and some of those aspects that may not have been as widely discussed in the media. And then also explain a little bit of how they actually did succeed. What was it that enabled this diplomacy, contrary to the perceptions and the predictions of the skeptics, to actually be successful and reach this conclusion. And then hopefully we will have a lively exchange, and I would very much appreciate an opportunity to engage those who may have a different perspective on this issue, or who are skeptical about what this deal ultimately will mean. I think, unfortunately, we have not had a good debate. We've had a debate. It wasn't a good debate. It was not a debate that really went into the substance. And coming here at the university, I hope there will be an opportunity to have such a discussion. I think there are several different reasons as to why this is a historic deal and something that history will judge quite positively. The two first reasons, obviously, are perhaps those who have been mostly presented in the media, but I think it's worthwhile to go over them again. First of all, I don't think we should have any doubt at this point that had it not been for this deal, the United States and Iran would have continued to gravitate towards a military confrontation. And we should have no doubt that during this period in which there was this escalatory policy on both sides, the United States was ratcheting up sanctions, imposing very, very tough sanctions on the Iranians. The Iranians responding by ratcheting up their nuclear program and getting closer and closer to a weapons capability in a very short breakout time. That during this period there were numerous instances in which things could have gotten out of control. People in the US military were very worried about it. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, made this case on numerous instances, saying that in the absence of dialogue, misunderstandings lead to miscalculations, which lead to escalation. And we do not have any de-escalatory mechanisms in place because we don't have a dialogue with the Iranian side. This was particularly worrisome for the US Navy that was in the very same limited space as the Navy of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in the Persian Gulf. Moreover, you had the wild card of what the Israeli Prime Minister would do. Some of the revelations that have come out by his former rival, but former defense minister, Ehud Barak, has made it very clear. They pushed very hard, particularly in the summer of 2012, to take unilateral military action. It ended up not happening, partly because so many other people inside cabinet of Netanyahu opposed it, and because the security establishment in Israel opposed it. But Ehud Barak and Netanyahu was pushing very hard to go in that direction. They failed. But the outcome was never certain. And from the US perspective, one of the key concerns that the Obama administration had was that regardless of how that military campaign would go, the likelihood that the United States would get sucked into that conflict was extremely high. And as much as the Obama administration had worked very hard to make sure that it would avoid getting entangled in more military campaigns in the Middle East, and we can debate how successful they have been in doing that or not, but nevertheless, the idea of getting sucked into a conflict at a time of not its choosing, but someone else's choosing, is even more disastrous for the United States. And we should also not forget that the US military's assessment of what it actually would take militarily to be able to be successful was not something that the US public or even the US politicians really could stomach. This was not going to be another Iraq in which the military phase of it would be very simple, but there would be a difficult phase afterwards. This would be one in which even the military phase would be tremendously difficult. In fact, if the objective was to make sure that Iran would not get a nuclear weapon, the military approach seemed to be the least likely one to succeed. Because after having been bombed, mindful of the fact that a complete destruction of the Iranians' knowledge of the nuclear fuel cycle was impossible to achieve without actually killing every scientist in Iran that had been involved in this, it would lead to a scenario in which afterwards the Iranians very aggressively would accelerate their efforts in order to be able to get the deterrence that a nuclear weapons potentially could provide them. As the former head of the IAEA, Hans Blick, said, the surest way of ensuring an Iranian bomb is to bomb Iran. This deal has averted that risk. We don't hear about the risk of war any longer. In fact, we have not even heard about it for the last 2 years, ever since diplomacy became serious. Secondly, which is the twin achievements of this deal, averting the disaster of a war with Iran and averting the disaster of a nuclear Iran. This deal closes off every path Iran would have in order to be able to build a nuclear weapon. This is very important to understand. There's been a lot of criticism about specific details of this, but bottom line is, every aspect of the Iranian nuclear program is scrutinized and inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency as a result of the Iranians signing on to the additional protocol as part of this deal. They have now started implementing it, and by year 8 of this deal, they will ratify it, making it part of their national legislation. Granted that the United States at that time, the US Congress at that time, lifts the sanctions. The sanction will be waived up until that point, but on year 8, it has to be lifted. This means that, and this is a very important thing, because there are elements of this deal that are temporary. Certain restrictions will last about 8 to 10, 15 years. The implementation of the additional protocol is permanent. This will continue forever. This is not something that is time-bound. And this is the most important element of this, because any success in making sure that the Iranians cannot build a nuclear bomb, and it's worth mentioning that they say that's not what they're seeking, but nevertheless, in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, is to build a deal that is based on transparency, inspections, and verification. And this is what this deal has achieved. There is a reason why this deal only has been controversial in 3 places on this planet: in the US Congress, in Israel, and in Saudi Arabia. For the rest of the world, this deal has been a complete no-brainer. In fact, there was no debate in Europe at all. One European diplomat asked me, baffled, what are we supposed to debate? We've been negotiating this for 2 years. We have plenty of reasons to be able to assess it, and we achieve everything we want with this deal. So those are the two things I'm sure you all have heard of. That's been part of the public discussion in the United States. I would like to add 3 other components that I think is very worthwhile considering when assessing this deal. The first one is that this deal has the potential, not guaranteed, has the potential of unleashing Iran's moderate society. A society that is one of the most moderate ones in the Middle East. Iran is quite opposite to many other countries in the region. Many countries of the region, incidentally almost all of them allies of the United States, are ruled by authoritarian rulers who, however bad they are, nevertheless tend to be more moderate than the societies that they rule, which has provided this conundrum that we're somewhat dependent on them, because if they're not there, we're fearful of what else would come. And I think the Arab Spring has strengthened that perception, mindful of the direction that it's gone. Iran is the major exception in the region that has a society that is far more moderate than the government that is ruling it. It is a society that carries and holds values that are far more compatible than the values of the society in Saudi Arabia, for instance, a traditional American ally. Now, that society has not necessarily been able to put its mark in the way that I think they would like, and I think the way perhaps we would like, of Iran's policies, whether internal or external. But it is that society that has ensured that Iran went in a moderate direction by electing the most moderate person that they had on the slate in 2013, by electing Rouhani. It is that society that held vigils in support of the United States in 2001 in reaction to the 9/11 attacks. It is that society that currently 60% of Iran's population belong to the middle class. According to Professor Salehi at Virginia Tech, one of the most prominent professors, experts on the Iranian economy, he recently did a study that showed that if this deal holds, if the sanctions get lifted, and if the sanctions relief actually does have an impact on the Iranian economy, which then could lead to, in a relatively moderate prediction, if the Iranian economy grows at 5% for the next 10 years, which is not that big, mindful of the size of the Iranian economy. It would be huge for the United States, but not for the Iranian economy. By 2025, the middle class in Iran would be 85%. A country that has 85% middle class, population who cares about where they can travel and where they can have their vacations, is more likely to be a country that will pursue status quo policies, seek stability in its immediate neighborhood, and not pursue radical policies. There are few examples of societies with that large of a middle class pursuing anti-status quo. No guarantee again, but particularly when there's been this argument, well, but they're going to get more money and they're going to become more powerful, doesn't that mean that they're just going to become more radical and pursue more problematic policies? That is based on the assumption that the Iranians are inherently seeking instability in the region, that their incentive structure will not be affected by their place in the world and the environment around them. And I think it's very hard to envision that a society with that large of a middle class would pursue the same type of approach that the Iranian government has pursued in the last decades or so. I think this is critical because I think our approach in Washington has oftentimes been to focus perhaps too exclusively on regimes. And clearly the regime in Iran constitutes a significant amount of challenges. But we have been so focused on the regime that we've lost sight of the society. Regimes come and go. Societies and populations endure. And it would be a huge mistake, in my view, to reduce Iran just to its regime, or even to one specific individual in that regime, and completely forget about the rest of the 80 million people who live there, who actually want to have a much more positive relationship with the United States. There were some amazing images that came out the day after the deal was struck, with young people in Iran dancing on the streets of Tehran, celebrating the deal, some of them sporting t-shirts saying, "I love the US." Now, I challenge you to find similar images anywhere else in the Middle East where you would see that happen. Particularly among some of the states that are allies of the United States. Fourth, the dialogue that now has come into existence and almost become normalized between the United States and Iran provides ample opportunity for conflict resolution ample opportunity to be able to better understand the perspectives of Iran and the United States, because one of the main problems is that the two sides have constantly miscalculated and misunderstood each other as a virtue of not being able to communicate, which then also opens up the door for potentially collaborating in areas where they do have common interests. They do have a common interest in making sure that ISIS gets defeated in Iraq and in Syria. And they have coordinated indirectly through the government of Iraq against ISIS in Iraq. But so much more can be done in this area. So much more can be done in the areas of common interest that they have in Afghanistan. At the end of the day, what this deal does, it recognizes that however much problems we have with the government of Iran, Iran is a major player in the region. And not having that communication means that on every issue, the two countries are opposed to each other, and on every issue, they try to undermine each other. By having the communication, they will continue to be able to oppose each other on various issues, but they will also be able to explore where do they not have to engage in oppositional activities. It was a very interesting interview that was given by the secretary, the head of the Iranian National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani, in December 2014. Asked by the Financial Times, what would the relationship between the United States and Iran look like in case a deal was reached? His answer was that he didn't foresee the United States and Iran becoming allies and partners. And frankly, I've never met anyone in Washington that would have thought that either, or even desired it. But he did say that the deal could enable the United States and Iran to stop using their energy against each other. That would be a significant shift, because for the last 35 years, the United States and Iran, in almost every arena in the Middle East, have sought to undermine each other, at the expense of the broader stability of the region. If that in and of itself is the only thing that comes out of this, that is still a game changer for the Middle East. And I think we've seen one small piece of evidence for the potential of the transformative quality that this deal could have had. Because this past weekend, for the first time, the United States managed to get everyone involved in the Syrian crisis at the table at the same time in Vienna. The prior two meetings in Geneva I and Geneva II, the Saudis essentially vetoed Iran's participation in those talks. And not particularly surprising, those talks led to absolutely nothing. Because in the absence of every critical player in the region being involved in those talks, we should have very low expectations of what could come out of those talks. Doesn't mean that the Vienna talks are going to be successful either. But at a minimum, the chances, the prospects of being able to reach something is far greater when all warring sides are at the table and talking to each other. And this could not have happened had it not been for the Iran deal first being reached. And I can explain why in greater detail during the Q&A. And that was one very critical sign of the potential of this deal having a transformative quality. And it leads me to the final reason. And it goes into the ability of the United States to say no to Saudi Arabia that now happened, and not allow the Saudis to sabotage the opportunity to have an all-encompassing dialogue in Vienna on the Syrian issue. There's been some who have been quite fearful or made an exaggerated accusation of saying that this deal is about the United States going into bed with Tehran, that this is an embrace of the Iranian regime, this is an embrace of Iran's position in the region. We are essentially succumbing to Iranian hegemony in the Middle East. Obviously, I'm exaggerating their exaggerations a little bit, but that's nevertheless what they've said. Two gentlemen at Brookings, I think, put it best, that this is not about going into bed with Tehran. This is about getting out of bed with Saudi Arabia. This deal enables the United States to have far greater maneuverability and leverage vis-a-vis some of its own friends and allies in the region in which it has had a rather unhealthy relationship. It enables the United States to, for instance, be able to say no to the Saudis when they are trying to dictate the terms of who can and who cannot be part of the dialogue on Syria in Vienna. And this has been something that the administration has been seeking for quite some time, because there's been no illusion in the minds of the administration of where the funding and ideological inspiration for some of the most vicious jihadi, Sunni, radical groups in the Middle East actually is coming from. And it's not coming from Iran. It's not to whitewash Iran and not to say that Iran has not caused problems. But put it in a larger context, it would be quite erroneous not to also address the problems that has been caused by the Saudis. But because of dependence on oil and a whole set of other issues, American maneuverability against Saudi Arabia has been very limited. Now we have an ability and an opportunity to rebalance and make sure that we have not an enmity with Saudi Arabia, I would not advocate that, but a healthier relationship in which the word no every once in a while also can be utilized. Having said this, I want to just quickly address one final point as to why these negotiations did succeed. And I'm doing so because it's been very common to hear in Washington, for understandable reasons, that the reason why these negotiations succeeded is because we imposed sanctions on Iran, it hurt the Iranians so bad, they came back crawling to the table, and we got a deal. Not only is this narrative tremendously simplistic, but it's also quite inaccurate. It's not to say that sanctions didn't play a role. Many different things did play a role, and so did sanctions. But we should have a better understanding of what specific role they played, and what other instruments actually played a more important role. Let me start off by saying this. I think that the sanctions, let me put it this way. After 2010, when it was clear that diplomacy at the first attempt had not worked and the United States went down the road of trying to get sanctions at the Security Council and then really ratcheting up the pressure on Iran in order to change Iran's nuclear calculus, make them realize that this was not worth it for them, that the United States would have more leverage and the Iranians would have to come back to the table and negotiate once the US actually had more leverage, essentially pushing them back to the negotiating table. It didn't quite work out that way, because what happened is that the Iranians responded saying, well, if the United States is going to change Iran's nuclear calculus by imposing these sanctions, Iran is also going to change the Western calculus about Iran by quickly accelerating the nuclear program. And that's exactly what happened. Once the sanctions were imposed, the Iranians ratcheted up their efforts. And Iran went from having 8,000 centrifuges at the time when Obama came in to reaching 22,000 centrifuges by the time diplomacy restarted in earnest. During this period, the Iranians went from having about 1,500 kilos of low-enriched uranium to having more than 10,000 kilos of low-enriched uranium. In addition to that, they also started producing medium enriched uranium at 19.75%, reaching about 193 kilos of that. They had 0 of that when Obama first came into office. If you remember the cartoonish picture of a bomb that Bibi Netanyahu used at the UN, he was referring to a line. The line he was referring to would be Iran reaching 250 kilos of 19.75% enriched uranium. And the Iranians never did, because as a result of this deal, it started to go down. But nevertheless, they were at 0, and they were now then at 193 by the time he appeared at the UN. And this led to a scenario in which the sanctions clock and the ability to cripple the economy of Iran actually ended up working slower than Iran's nuclear clock. If this trajectory had continued without any exit back to diplomacy, the likelihood was greater that the Iranians would reach a de facto nuclear bomb than that the United States would have managed to cripple the Iranian economy and bring them down to their knees. It was this realization that was part of the reason as to why the United States reached out to an ally in the Arab world and sought its assistance to be able to open up a secret channel of diplomacy with the Iranians outside of the P5+1 track in order to be able to get movement and be able to get out of this dynamic, which was more likely to lead to either an acceptance of an Iranian bomb or a bombing of Iran, then it would lead to the capitulation of Iran. So it reached out to the country of Oman, who had played a critical role in the release of 3 American, they're called hikers, but they're more than just hikers. They're accomplished journalists, etc., etc. They hiked once and now they're forever known as being hikers. Oman proved its ability to maneuver the Iranian political system, and they ensured that an exchange took place. 3 Iranians were also released from American prisoners. And this was critical. Few other countries had managed to show that diplomatic depth and the ability to be trusted by both the United States and by the Iranians. Summer of 2012, Oman hosts a secret round of talks. 2 senior people from the Obama administration go there, 4 people from the Iranian side. The key objective of the American side was to assess, is this channel something that is endorsed by the supreme leader of Iran? Is this an authoritative channel? Are we negotiating with those that actually make the decision? The key objective of the Iranians was to push the United States to understand that Iran would never engage in anything beyond talking unless the United States dropped the zero enrichment objective. The idea that the only acceptable nuclear program in Iran would be one that did not exist. This was the position of the Bush administration. Reducing Iran's centrifuges from 8,000 or 22,000 down to 0. And the Iranians made it very clear over and over again that unless there was an acceptance that whatever outcome would be, it would be more than 1 centrifuge in Iran or 0 centrifuges, there would be really no diplomacy taking place. At the time, the US was not ready to play that card. I believe the administration from the outset always was ready to play that card. They knew there would not be a deal unless there was an acceptance that Iran would continue to have enrichment on its own soil. The question was when and how to play that card. Summer 2012, the United States was not ready. Then we hit the US elections, but then in March of 2013, another round in Oman, in the city of Muscat, the capital of Oman, and this time around the United States sent a much larger delegation and a much more senior one, and for the first time authorized the US to play that card, to communicate orally to the Iranians that this could happen, although with a lot of caveats, etc. All of this happens before Rouhani gets elected. All of this happens while the sanctions are still in place. At those talks in Oman, the Iranians were not convinced. The mistrust was so deep, they wanted this to be put in writing, and without so many caveats. So the Omanis decided to intervene. They called in the American delegation to give a debriefing of how the negotiations had gone after 3 days of talks. And there the Sultan of Oman had planned to ask the Americans, will you accept enrichment in Iran? He didn't have to. The American side volunteered that they would accept, but they couldn't put it in writing and they couldn't put it in front of the Iranians in that clear language. The Omani Sultan then calls in the Iranians to ask for their debriefing, and there the Iranians again predictably say, we can't really move because we're not sure if the Americans are going to accept enrichment or not. And he tells them, you don't have to worry about it, they have already assured me that they will. Suspicious as the Iranians are, they said, well, we need more than that. We need something in writing. The Omanis go back to the American side and see what can be done, and the administration, even though it was ready to play the card, could not put it in writing. It's too risky. If it had come back out in DC, it would be highly problematic. So instead, they utilized one person who had been critical in establishing Channel in the first place. He was at the time the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, John Kerry. He writes a letter, not to the Iranians, but to the Omanis, saying the United States will accept enrichment on Iranian soil. And the Sultan of Oman hands this letter over to the Iranians. Then the Sultan had to deliver what the Americans wanted, to make sure that this was an authoritative channel and that Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, would respect and support it. The Sultan flies in between his chemotherapy to Iran and sits down face to face with the supreme leader of Iran and hears it from his mouth directly that the supreme leader is backing this deal. So what happened was that in the midst of this Arab, Persian, Sunni, Shia thing, it was an Arab country that actually played a critical role of bridging the difference between the United States and Iran. The only thing that could happen in a scenario in which the two sides had such a deep mistrust of each other, you needed to find one entity that both sides actually trusted sufficiently that that entity could bridge that gap. And the Omanis played their cards beautifully and brilliantly and made this happen. And all of this before Rouhani got elected. Rouhani was briefed on this once he got elected and was actually quite shocked. He had no idea that this was taking place. Now, what did sanction do in all of this? Well, in one way, sanctions, precisely because it didn't work, forced a secret negotiation to take place in order to find an exit out of what otherwise more likely was going to lead to a confrontation rather than an Iranian capitulation. But also, if we take a step back and look at it over a course of a longer period of time, we have to ask ourselves, what is the alternative cost? What is the opportunities that we lose when we so intensely focus only on coercive measures? Let's take a look at the projection of the Iranian nuclear program and the offers that have been at the table in the past that were rejected. In 2005, the Iranians sent their last negotiation proposal to the Europeans in the negotiation that was taking place at the time without the US, because the US at the time would not be at the table. And it was handed over by Zarif, the current foreign minister, who at the time was the UN ambassador. And this proposal, incidentally, is public. That proposal, the Iranians offered to cap their enrichment program at 3,000 centrifuges. The Europeans didn't even deliver it to the American side, knowing very well that anything above 0 would have been rejected by the Bush administration. But the Iranians would have accepted 3,000 if that proposal was genuine and honest one. And now, those of you who know the details of the deal know that the Iranians are actually going to be keeping 6,000 centrifuges. Twice the amount that could have been secured, absent any of these sanctions, if we had been willing to play the enrichment card much, much sooner. I saw Zarif during many of the rounds of the negotiations, and I don't remember which round it was, but for some reason, the topic of that proposal came up. And he laughed and he said, yeah, that was only our first offer. We were willing to go down to 1,000. We would have accepted 1,000 centrifuges. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. Perhaps he's exaggerating, but bottom line is that the Iranians had 22,000 centrifuges, 19,000 of them were functioning. The deal ended up cutting it with 2/3, reaching about 6,000. 2/3 of 3,000 is 1,000. So perhaps there is some validity in what he's saying. And this is important to understand, because as the West was clearly putting pressure on Iran and adding that leverage that could be used in the negotiations, the Iranians were doing exactly the same thing. And the question is, at the end of it, did we really get much more than what we could have gotten earlier? In one of the briefings at the White House, one of the lead negotiators said to us that, you know, if we could just get back to that proposal the Iranians gave in 2005, we would jump on it right away. I think this is important to keep in mind, because I think while we have to understand the role of sanctions and we cannot entirely dismiss it, in order to make sure that this is an exercise and a policy that we learn from, in order to make sure that next time we pursue it even more efficiently, we have to have a more honest conversation about what really the coercive elements provided us and what didn't. Because we have a tendency of trying to, because we have to look tough, no one wants to look weak. Smart is an equivalent of weak in the American political context right now. We put too much emphasis on the coercive measures, and we're not appreciating the fact that many problems actually can more easily and more quickly be resolved if we actually can find a compromise. And we're willing to actually play with incentives more so than just with disincentives. I'll stop there and take your questions. Okay, so people will step up and stand in line. Okay.
Fascinating presentation, and I thank you. Could you speak a little bit about the reaction of the Iranian people to the deal?
The reaction of the Iranian people has been overwhelmingly positive. A poll came out, I think, about a month and a half ago or a month ago, in which, in fact, for the Rouhani government, the problem was that his popularity was so high, it was stratospheric, it's almost 80%. So he had no other place to go but to go down. So his challenge right now is perhaps exaggerated expectations of what it will do, because the reactions have been so positive inside the country. Now there are elements, of course, who are opposed to it inside of Iran as well. They tend to be more within the political elite than in the larger society. But overall, the population wants an end to this confrontation with the United States. Even though there may be strong disagreements with US foreign policy, and even though there may be grudges and mistrust, the United States is not figuring as the top threat or enemy in the mindset of the population. In fact, I would also add this. The threats that are primarily identified by the Iranian Supreme National Council for Security is number one, the spread of jihadism and sectarianism. This is the main threat, and the reason for that is quite understandable. None of these entities have the same military power as the United States. None of them would even get close to the type of damage they could do militarily to Iran. But the United States have this amazing military power, but any effort that it would use to use its military would also have the effect of actually increasing cohesion within Iranian society. It would bring the population and the regime closer together. It would have a rallying around the flag type of an effect. The sectarianism doesn't have the military power. And it can't do that damage, but it can do a much more dangerous damage. It can increase the differentiation within the society. It can increase the tensions between ethnic groups. It can increase the tensions between religious groups inside of the society, particularly in Iran's border areas where there are Sunni minorities, etc. This is viewed as the main threat for the Iranians by the Supreme National Security Council. Its head, as I mentioned, Ali Shamkhani, incidentally, is an Iranian Arab. He is of the Arab minority of the Iranian population. No one here would be able to guess what the second threat is, according to the Iranian National Security Council. I'll give you guys a chance. Guess which one the second one is. Sorry?
Climate change.
Ah, you knew it. You ruined my experiment. Climate change. Climate change is defined as the second biggest threat. The Iranians and the Middle East as a whole has been hit by a drought. And Iran is going to be one of the hardest hit countries by climate change and the drought that will spread in the next decade or so. And it's going to hit the areas of Iran where most of its food is being grown. They already have water shortage problems, they have mismanaged that. Sanctions has also to a certain extent contributed to them not having good technology. This is going to create massive problems inside of Iran in the next decade unless it is properly addressed. And it's very fascinating that the Iranians, who otherwise use such a harsh rhetoric and so aggressive, etc., that they are defining these things. I don't think the United States and Israel is even in the top 3 when it comes to the most acute threats that they're facing right now.
Yes, I too echo the admiration for your presentation. Having been in Iran in 2007 for 3 weeks, having traveled around and read the English language Iranian media, I'm aware of how prideful Persia is and how they felt discounted and not on equal standing. And that has been, it seems to me, part of the pushback, that we don't acknowledge that they have kept their boundaries forever, one of the few countries in the Middle East that has. And so we have discounted them, and they take that very seriously. My question is, would you please address the issue of Iran's support for Hezbollah and Hamas?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. The Iranians have had a long-standing, in fact, a founding position with Hezbollah. And it is something that have grown out of the policy that existed in Iran back in the early 1980s. Back then, it wasn't the United States talking about regime change, it was Iran. They had their revolution and they wanted to overthrow many of the other monarchies in the region, and they wanted to create replicas of themselves by having small Islamic republics here and there. Their success was essentially zero. Nowhere else was there any revolution of that kind or an Islamic state being built. The only areas where they had a minimum amount of success was in areas where there was a Shia majority or large Shia populations. You had that in Lebanon. There was attempts in Bahrain which failed. There was attempts in Iraq that didn't succeed then but succeeded 30 years later thanks to the United States invasion of Iraq. But they were essentially looking for the Shia pockets. And Iran has had a long-standing relationship with the Shias in the south of Lebanon. That relationship I would find very difficult seeing that it would change in the sense that the Iranians would abandon Hezbollah. I don't think that is in the cards at all. From the perspective of the Iranians, they are a Shia, Persia majority country in a sea surrounded by Sunnis and or Arabs. The only natural potential friends they see in the region are of other minorities, primarily if they are Shia. Not particularly different from the way that Ben Gurion saw Israel's security. Looking at non-Arab, non-Muslim, if possible, minorities throughout the region in order to be able to balance Israel's being surrounded by majority Sunni Arab states in its vicinity. As a result, that relationship or the idea that it would discontinue, I don't see as in the card. Could it reform, however? I think absolutely. Hezbollah is primarily a concern for the Israelis because of its military prowess and the absence of a true peace between Lebanon and Israel. And I would look at how the Iranian profile on Israel has changed. I hope people have noticed it in the last 2 years as a direct result of the negotiations, as a direct result of the Iranians being genuine or trying to reach a deal. Look at the rhetoric of Ahmadinejad and his venomous comments about denying the Holocaust and his comments about Israel. And I ask you, have you heard any comments from Rouhani in the last 2 years about Israel, beyond 2 tweets wishing the Jewish people happy Rosh Hashanah? This is not a coincidence. This has come because of a clear realization that if the Iranians want to move and find a new relationship with the United States and resolve the nuclear issue, they cannot do so while simultaneously pursue the same rhetoric and posture vis-a-vis Israel. And that also then includes the constraints that need to be then put into place on Hezbollah. But I want to caution that by saying that if there's any belief that anytime soon the Iranians will abandon Hezbollah, it's completely unlikely in my assessment. Hamas is a completely different story. Hamas comes out of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. There's probably people in this room that know much more about it. But Hamas has never had a particularly strong affinity towards Iran. On the contrary, Hamas has oftentimes ended up going to Iran when they didn't have other options. So for instance, after some of the pause of the Bush administration clamping down on Saudi support and financial support for Hamas, the Hamas leadership had no choice but to go to the Iranians and seek financial support because the Saudi funding had been dried up or closed off. And today, the relationship between Hamas, despite a few attempts to rebuild them, remain very strained because of Hamas's position in favor of the uprising in Syria and Iran's support in favor of Assad. Again, Israel doesn't figure that much into these calculations. They're much more, the politics at home tend to be much more important.
Thank you for your talk. I agree with you that you're saying that this deal is gonna boost Iran's economy and also international safety. But it seems there is another issue with this deal. As you know, that in the latest letter of the Supreme Leader, he is threatening the international society that if they want to add any sanctions for human rights issue, they're gonna end the deal. It seems that it's good for Iran's economy, but for Iranians inside Iran, it may add restrictions and also boost human rights issues in Iran. And as the international safety is increasing, there may be no other country caring about human rights inside Iran. Don't you think that this deal is gonna do that?
Thank you so much. I think that's a very important point that you're raising. And it is particularly a legitimate concern, mindful of what we're seeing taking place in Iran right now. We're now in a phase in which actually repression has increased. There's been a wave of attacks just in the last week. You may have heard about the Iranian-American Siamak Namazi who's been arrested, but there's been plenty of others who don't get the same attention. Iranian journalists, some of them very prominent, that have now, just in the last couple of days, in fact hours, been rounded up. I think that's a very valid concern. I would, however, put it in a larger context. First of all, human rights sanctions have, in and of themselves, rarely had any particularly important effect on the human rights situation in Iran. There's been sanctions for the last 35 years, many of them targeting human rights, and we have not seen any particular improvement. So pinning one's hope that sanctions on human rights would in and of itself resolve the tensions and the problems in Iran, I think is wildly optimistic, because we've seen no credit for that. On the contrary, you see that the human rights defenders in Iran have overwhelmingly come out in support of this deal. They've been very strongly taking risks and spoken out in favor of this deal because of a realization that at the end of the day, if the deal is successful, if the economy opens up, there's a higher likelihood, no guarantee, but a higher likelihood that it will also lead to a greater opening of society. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a linear process, and which means that the day after the deal, suddenly Iran becomes Sweden or Switzerland. Clearly that's not going to be the case. But the chances of it being able to move in the right direction is greater with the deal than it would be absent the deal. Furthermore, some of the human rights activists in Iran, I think, have pointed out to something that is extremely valid. if there hadn't been for the deal, and if the two sides had continued to gravitate towards a military conflict, and you actually ended up in a war, plenty of innocent people would have been killed as a result of that military confrontation. Human rights is not just about individuals or bloggers or journalists being able to speak and write about what they want to write and be able to have due process. That's definitely part of human rights. But it's also human rights, the right to life, not to be get killed in an unnecessary war. And one of the human rights activists said that war is the ultimate human rights abuse. So being able to have a deal that averts that disaster is in and of itself a major plus for human rights. It doesn't resolve all issues, and many issues are going to remain very, very problematic. And the international community needs to be much more serious about human rights in Iran. To think, however, that only can happen through sanctions, I'm very skeptical about. I don't see sanctions as being particularly effective when it comes to these types of things. But there's an opportunity now, as a result of this dialogue, to be able to raise these issues. It's been so difficult for the United States to address human rights in Iran when it couldn't even talk to the Iranians. We had to rely on the Swiss, who are the protectors of American interests in Iran, to be able to handle that. And the Swiss have done a fabulous job, but it's never going to be as powerful and as effective as actually having the United States itself engage in it. But we have to remain vigilant, and I share your concern that at the end of the day, if we completely disregard this factor, we could end up having a very negative scenario there. I wouldn't say, however, that likelihood is automatic or that the deal in and of itself increases the likelihood for that. On the contrary, the vast majority of human rights activists and defenders in Iran have come out in support of this deal precisely because of the calculation that a more open Iran is more likely to be an Iran that is showing greater respect for human rights.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this illuminating discussion. My question is kind of an addendum to this conversation you offered with regard to Hezbollah. I'll kind of begin with an anecdote. After the deal went through, in my euphoria on social media, I noticed that several of my colleagues who are very vested in the issue of Syria were frankly livid, and further conversation kind of revealed their concern that with this deal, Iranian support for the semi-genocidal regime of Bashar al-Assad will simply be financially emboldened. And kind of to dovetail your comment about how discourse and rhetoric with regard to Israel has kind of been recalibrated, we really haven't seen any recalibration on discourse towards the support of the Assad regime in Syria. So my question is, what can we really expect in the aftermath of this deal vis-a-vis the situation in Syria?
I think that's a great question, and I think also one of the reasons why I shared your euphoria, but the euphoria was dampened by the fact that so many things in the region is going in the wrong direction. And the Syrian civil war obviously is one of them, and the likelihood of more violence in Israel and Palestine is another. First of all, I think if you depart from the assumption that ultimately there is no military solution in Syria, and ultimately all sides have to come to the table and try to find some sort of a diplomatic political solution, which will have to start off with some form of a ceasefire, then I think the deal actually is very good, because that will enable this. If you're departing from the assumption that ultimately you just have to defeat Assad, and as a result the deal is bad because Iran will now have, down the road at least, more finances that it potentially could use for Assad, then I can understand that that conclusion is valid given that assumption. I disagree with the assumption. I don't think there is any military solution in Syria. In fact, there could have been diplomatic openings that could have been seized. There were diplomatic openings that could have been seized 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And they constantly were deferred because everyone was hoping that they would be able to get the upper leg militarily and then potentially go to the negotiating table. And all that has led to is that more people have been slaughtered by many different sides in the conflict, primarily, of course, by Assad. The thing that is now more promising is a realization in practice that there is no military solution, and we have to get everyone at the table. And I know there's going to be after the brutality of the Assad regime, clearly there's going to be a lot of emotions and a lot of folks that will be skeptical, etc. I think that's absolutely understandable. But if we take a step back and try to look at the trajectory of the situation, I think it's critical to recognize that there is no military solution. We need to get to the table as quickly as possible. We need to have the small ceasefires in various places and then slowly but surely start creating a scenario in which a political process actually could be viable and possible.
First of all, thank you for your talk, and I was just attending one of your talks a few years ago at UNC Chapel, and during that talk you mentioned like the sabotages and everything that happened in the 2005 negotiation and how the deal just like didn't even go through. The changes that we see happening is because, you know, it's President Obama's second term. He is not worried about re-election, and he's leaving office in 1.5 years. The hardliners in Iran bring that up, and also you see it every night in the news. In 1.5 years, we will have a new president. If it's a Republican, everyone is implying that the first thing that they will do, they will tear up the deal. And even in the Republicans, in the Democratic side, I think the frontrunner is Hillary Clinton, and as a woman, I support her, but I don't think they're as friendly to this idea. And what will happen, do you think, with the administration, either Republican or Democrat, who comes to the power in 1.5 years, and can they just basically throw away the deal? Thank you.
I think that's a great question. It's not just something that has worried people in Iran, or as you mentioned, has been mentioned in Iranian media, but it is something that many have worried about. And I would say, clearly, the role of President Obama, and I would also add Secretary Kerry, have been absolutely instrumental. They necessitated a belief that diplomacy could work, to be willing to take the political risk, which was clearly a very significant political risk. This ended up being the biggest fight the president had to fight, even bigger than healthcare. It necessitated a belief that this could go somewhere, to make that type of an immense political investment. And I believe that several of the people who are now candidates, or were candidates before, would not have taken that risk. And they would have pursued other policies instead, and I think would have led to a disaster. Having said that, Secretary Clinton have come out strongly in support of the deal. She has tried to take credit for it, and she deserves some credit for it. One of her close associates, or one of the individuals who started who were main players in the Oman channel, and she deserves some credit for this. I think what is now important is not so much the individuals. The individuals will continue to matter, but their role will be perhaps a little bit less, because it's no longer about taking a huge political risk and courage to invest in a new process. It's about protecting something that is already there. And here, rather, it's the other thing that I think is going to be more decisive. In the next 14 months, if this deal is properly implemented, if on December 15th there is a strong report from the IEA that says and verifies that the Iranians have done everything they've said that they should do, that sanctions relief starts taking place without obstruction from Congress, that no new sanctions are imposed, even though they're not necessarily a violation of the deal, but they could complicate matters tremendously, that Congress doesn't do what it has done in other places, in which it actually has delayed things, etc., in order to complicate matters. In fact, some Republican members of Congress have spelled out that that's exactly what they're planning to do. If that doesn't happen, and in 14 months you have had a very successful deal, the Iranians have gone a long way in dismantling the parts of the program that they committed to dismantle. Sanctions relief is having a de facto effect on the Iranian economy. Then you will be in a scenario in which it will be very difficult to undo this deal. It will be next to irreversible. And it will provide the next president, whether Republican or Democrat, with the ability to say to those pressuring him or her to undo the deal, I'm sorry, this is now set in stone. This has been cemented. It's been so successful. I can't do it. If, however, in the next 14 months, we have a very fragile deal, the implementation has been problematic, question marks and unanswered questions remain, the IEA is not giving a strong endorsement of the implementation, the Iranians are not doing everything they're supposed to be doing, they're reinterpreting things, or new question marks are arising. Congress is continuing to be what Congress tends to do on these issues. Then you may have a situation in 14 months that whether you have a Democrat or a Republican, they may not have the strength to be able to push back against the pressure that most likely will come to start undoing this deal. So more than the individuals, I would say the next 14 months and the implementation of the deal is going to be absolutely critical.
Thank you, Trita. I have two questions, if I may. One it's probably a little easier to answer. Do we know that Iran ever enriched uranium beyond 20%?
No, the IAEA, there were occasions in which at one point some traces had been found of uranium that had been enriched, I think, to about 27%. And the IAEA did an investigation, this is back in 2005, and they saw, no, actually this was not 2005, this was later, and they saw no evidence that it had actually been any effort to go beyond 20%. But rather than when you do it, you can have small samples that go by. I'm not a nuclear physicist, so I don't know the exact science of it. But it can happen that enrichment goes a little bit higher in small samples. So the IAEA actually did a secret investigation, and they found no evidence for it.
Okay. So the other one is...
Having said that, back in the 1970s, the United States gave Iran 93% enriched uranium during the time of the Shah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So the other one is, I have a few newspaper clips. These are from Duke Chronicle, daily newspaper, primarily written by students. This one is by a Duke engineering student that says Iran's supreme leader has committed to wiping Israel off the map within the next 25 years. And freshly funded with $150 billion from the Obama administration, that goal is unfortunately far more attainable. So what is your take on this type of...
So there was a lot that was made off of the fact that as part of the sanctions, money that the Iranians place in foreign banks to handle their imports had been frozen, and as part of the deal, it would be unfrozen. Some characterize it that this would be a signing bonus, that we actually would give out of the US Treasury money to the Iranians. That's never been the case, and that's a complete distortion of what this deal would do. Iranian money that had been frozen as part of the sanctions would be unfrozen as part of the sanctions relief. That money is in Japanese, Swiss banks, etc., that they use for imports. Much of that had already been committed. There's a great article by a former student of mine, Eric Lowe, who spent some time in Iran in the Washington Post today, on what they will actually use that money for based on all the needs that they have and the budget commitments that they have made. But it's part of that larger conception that Iran is not going to change. It's going to remain hostile vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis Israel. Its behavior is not changeable. It's only a function of how much resources they have. And as a result, the more resources they have, the more problematic they are. The less they have, the less problematic they are. And I've seen no credible evidence, first of all, that any country would have completely unchanging incentive structures. Or B, that actually a lesser enriched, a lesser wealthy Iran would be less problematic. Let's face it, in the last 35 years, the Iranians have had a tremendous amount of economic problems because of their own conduct, their own incompetence, their own mismanagement, their own corruption. Yet, the behavior that we find very problematic has not necessarily reduced as a result of that. On the contrary, one of the baffling things for some of Iran's neighbors that are very much afraid of Iran is that the GCC outspends Iran with a factor of 13 on arms. The Saudis alone spend more than $80 billion on arms. The Iranians spend about 10. And the Iranians are achieving much, much more with far, far less because it's not a function of money. It's not expensive to do some of the things that the Iranians have been doing. Cutting off that money is not going to have a particular effect. On the contrary, we've seen in the past that their way of reacting to this is actually to increase the cost for the United States by being more problematic. If the policy of the United States is not to recognize Iran, not talk to Iran, not to try to come to terms with Iran, the Iranians are going to make that policy as costly as possible for the United States by increasing the cost of keeping Iran isolated and out. The exact mirror image of the hawkish line in the United States, in which we say, well, if they're not doing what we want, we're going to increase the cost for them of pursuing these policies that we don't like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parsi, for your great speech. My name is Amir. I'm a Vice President of Computer Science Graduate Student Association at NC State. My question is about after lifting sanctions, our situation after lifting sanctions. Actually, my wife, she was an Iranian student here at NC State. Unfortunately, passed away due to cancer last year. I remember she was she was a Duke patient, and Duke doctors told us that we don't have a good view about cancer, different types of cancer in Iran. So, that was very difficult for them to find out what's going on. So, after she passed away, I dedicated my career to cancer, and I'm right now collaborating with many scientists at Duke, UNC, and NC State. I would like one day, after lifting these sanctions, I would like to connect scientists in Iran and here in North Carolina to somehow, help Iranian people to deal with this problem. However, as you know, as our friend pointed out, there are some issues with human rights, right? The sanctions. There's no clear line whether this type of work or fields are going to be critical, or it's okay to work on it. I was wondering whether your association is going to help somehow, to clear it, that we can work or collaborate on with which topics. So this is my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amir, and thank you for what you have done. I know of the difficulties that you've gone through based on the communication we had in the past, and I'm very pleased to be able to finally meet you in person as well. You're quite right. There's a tremendous amount of areas in which the two sides could benefit from scientific exchanges and collaboration. Despite of their hardships, Iran's scientific base is a very strong one, and they're in the leading nations when it comes to stem cell research, when it comes to neuroscience and many other areas. And there's a huge potential and interest on the American side. I would say within the university it is quite overwhelming. And it's also very strong within the Iranian universities. The problem right now is partly the sanctions issue, but perhaps mainly the problems that are caused on the Iranian side by those inside of Iran who fear openness far more than they fear isolation and American sanctions. Sanctions have been a blessing to them. Openness is what they panic about. And right now, as I mentioned earlier on, we are in what I hope and I believe is just a phase in which they are given some space to react, and they're doing many negative things. But if it is a phase, then it means that there's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then there's going to be 2 steps forward again. We're probably right now in that 1 step back phase. And the expectation of most people is that this will last for a couple of months. But ultimately, this is a profound threat. If this becomes more than just a phase, it's a profound threat to the Rouhani government. Because if they want to see the economy prosper, if they want to make sure that the success of the deal translates into a better economy, which translates into Rouhani's re-election, then they have to make sure that those who are trying to build bridges have the protection to build bridges. Right now they don't. Right now, anyone who has been industrious and entrepreneurial and trying to reconnect the American people and the Iranian people and try to create some of those exchanges have become targets. If that situation remains, and that would be a major threat not just to society but also to the government itself, if it changes, which I hope will be the case, then hopefully a year from now we will look back at this period and say it was a dark chapter in an otherwise pretty good journey. Thank you.
Thank you for your very clear and step-by-step exposition of developments. I'm Ming Sing Ho. I teach in anthropology and history on Islamic societies in the Middle East and Asia. I think, at least to me, it is clear that sea change in Iranian-US relations would have ramifications across the board and be overwhelmingly positive for both countries in the long term. The problem is getting from the short term to the long term, and you've been very clear on the short term and step-by-step process. What I'd like to ask you is about the resistance to this sea change. On the Iranian side, I think the resistance is in a narrow circle of losers. There will be winners and losers. The losers will be a narrow circle. You've addressed some of it. But could you give us some more detail or your thoughts on who the losers are and the dynamics of their play? On the American side, it is very clear that if they were able to do a deal with Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen a lot of problems would be solved across the board. And I think the US military is very aware of this. And I had thought that President Obama had this idea right from when he came in, to do a major deal which would go along with his demilitarization agenda. So I had thought that this deal with Iran was perhaps along those lines of thinking. Now your presentation makes me think that actually it was more immediate, the immediate issue of not having war with Iran that was pushing the Obama strategy. So I'm not quite clear which one it is for the Obama side. And more generally, I'd like to ask you, how much of there exists across the US, its various institutions, interest groups, and so on, that a realization that some sort of broad-ranging deal with Iran would actually be overwhelmingly positive for this country? I think so that's those are the two questions for you. I think the Obama administration has flip-flopped. This partial retreat in the past couple of years has led to essentially a proxy war between Saudi, Abu Dhabi, and Iran. It has completely inflamed Syria, Yemen, or other places. I thought Obama had to step back in to do this deal with Iran as part of, again, a big deal, which then perhaps got the Russians afraid that they might be left out of a major move, and that's why they came back in. But in any case, just the two questions for you, the very narrow circle in Iran, and what possibility of a broader understanding across the US?
Thank you. When it comes to the latter part, there's no contradiction. Without a doubt, the president does see Iran as part of a larger strategy of both the demilitarization of American foreign policy, but more importantly, a reduction over the overcommitment that the United States has in the Middle East, which is losing strategic significance, and the undercommitment strategically to East Asia, where it is far more likely that America's peer competitor will emerge. So that has always been part of the thinking, part of the reason also why there was an attempt, in the absence of a direct sense of that this could lead to a war in 2009. But the imminence of the war risk was certainly something that helped focus the administration's mind and make sure that they had to get this done sooner rather than later. But it is consistent. Now, why doesn't the administration talk so much about it? Because at the end of the day, even though, in my assessment, this is a reprioritization of the United States on a global scale, where does it need to be more committed, where does it need to be less committed, it does come across as a withdrawal from the Middle East. And even however you yet turn this around, a withdrawal will look like some form of American capitulation in the Middle East, and it would simply not go down well domestically in the United States. So the effort has been not to talk about it so much. In fact, it's better if people debate and think the administration doesn't have a strategy than that they would understand what the strategy is and cast it as a withdrawal or cast it as a capitulation. I personally don't think it is a capitulation. I agree wholeheartedly that there has been an overcommitment, and that in the long run, strategically for the United States, constantly getting dragged into military confrontations in the region, not so much because of its own interest, but because of the interest of some of its allies, would ultimately weaken the United States for much larger challenges that will emerge in the next 2 or 3 decades. So that's on the first issue. Who then are the people inside of Iran who would be losing of this? And you're quite right, there's winners and there's losers. There are losers in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard who have made a lot of money off of sanctions, who have benefited from the protection that sanctions have enabled them to get this very strong monopolistic position that they have in the economy. They have been some of the most adamant opponents of this. And right now we see some of their efforts. I don't think their efforts have been permitted or can go as far as to actually undermine the deal, but they've been given some space to create some issues and some problems. At one point, Rouhani, who has a tendency of speaking a little bit more firmly than previous presidents on this issue, so that those in Iran who have made an income out of sanctions need to find themselves some new jobs. Because sanctions will be lifted, and we're not going to let the rest of the population suffer just because a minority has managed to find ways to make money. Let's look back at what happened this past summer. Suddenly you had a couple of very worrisome incidents in the Persian Gulf, where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy was doing some rather worrisome things, pretending to attack certain ships, shooting across the bow of some Singaporean ships, etc. This was all done under the command of the person at the IRGC who's responsible for the Persian Gulf. Now, what does he do? Well, if you're responsible for the Persian Gulf and the IRGC, that means that you're the one who's making the most money off of smuggling, because that's where the smuggling is taking place. And they were doing these things precisely because of their fear of the opening up. And that opening up is not just economic. It does have a very strong economic dimension. There's also elements in the IRGC who recognize that they may lose a bit of their monopolistic position in the economy, but they can actually make even more money if the economy opens up. So IRGC is also not monolithic. There are elements there that are quite supportive of this. There's also an interesting thing on the American side, in which we saw quite clearly over the course of this past summer how strong and how emotional at times the opposition to, not the deal, it wasn't the details of the deal. The details of the deal could have changed dramatically. And Tom Cotton would still have put together a letter of 47 senators opposing it. It had nothing to do with the details of the deal. It had to do with several different factors. Some of it purely partisan, not wanting to see the president get any foreign policy successes. But part of it also about reasons that I find understandable, legitimate. I disagree with them, but I think there's an air of truth in it. This deal, any deal with Iran, essentially means that the United States will not have any interest in the survival of the regime in Iran, but it will suddenly have an interest in some degree of regime stability in order to make sure that the deal continues to be properly implemented. In essence, that means, and it very explicitly it means, that the United States is no longer in the business of seeking regime change in Iran. For some in the United States, that is unacceptable. Now, from my perspective, I don't see that as being that problematic, because I don't see the United States being particularly competent about pursuing regime change in a positive way almost anywhere in the Middle East. Just because it is in a stated policy doesn't mean that it's particularly effective or it actually has a good outcome. I would definitely like to see Iran move in a clear, secular and democratic direction, but it's only the people of Iran that can do so. It doesn't matter how much the United States wishes for that to happen. It is not in any position to be able to drive that change. That change can only be driven from individuals inside of the country itself. So it's not much of a loss in my sense, but I can understand for those who would like to see a much stronger American presence in the region, who do not want to see the United States reducing its commitment to the region, whether it is because of strategic reasons or it is because of commitment to Israel or to Saudi Arabia, that this deal ultimately means that the United States have come to accept formally that Iran is a major player in the region, and that it's a player that you have to deal with. That the United States is no longer going to sign up to an Israeli or Saudi strategy of perpetual containment of Iran and be all out against Iran in every corner of the region. If there are areas in which collaboration could take place, that's something the United States would like to explore. And there's those who view this as an acceptance of Iran's position beyond what is justified and legitimate. There are those who also believe, who recognize that at the end of the day, this is an interesting deal because a country in the Middle East in some ways managed to get the entire P5+1, the major powers of the world, to come to the negotiating table, have a very lengthy, very tough negotiation, and the end result of that negotiation was a compromise. It wasn't the United States dictating the terms of the deal, nor was it Iran dictating the terms of the deal. Both sides had to compromise despite the overwhelming discrepancy of power between the two sides. If you are, perhaps if I could use the word, more imperialistic in your mindset, this is not a good thing. You want to see the United States constantly dictate the terms and absolutely not engage in some of these compromises. I can understand that. I disagree with it because I don't believe that was in the cards. When we tried to dictate it, we actually saw the Iranian program continuously grow and actually become more problematic. And I think it took a degree of maturity to understand that if we're truly interested in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, a compromise was absolutely necessary. What I find unfortunate is that some of these concerns were never raised in the debate. Instead, a lot of, in my view, rather artificial and superficial concerns were raised, instead of going to the very core of the matter, because this does signal a profound change in the Middle East.
So I think we've come to the end of our time. I just want to remind everybody that what Dr. Parsi said at the beginning was that he is preparing his third book, and I want to join everybody here in hoping that it's as predictive of the future as his previous book on one roll of the dice, and that losing an enemy is what we've just heard about today. Thank you very much.